Hello and welcome to Cinema to the Letter. This episode, it's that new film known as Skinamarink. On Cinema to the Letter, we break down the very nature of cinema, letter by letter. For each episode of a film miniseries topic, we cover 6 films that fit a C for classic, I for indie, N for new, E for egregious, M for masterpiece, and A for atypical. Who doesn't love an acronym, am I right? I am Thomas, and I apologize if the acoustics are a bit weird. I'm recording this episode from the ceiling. It's a long story. But, I think it'll still work out as long as nothing falls. And I think, based on past events, I don't think it'll fall. It'll just stay there permanently.
Hi, I'm David, and I'm scared because this is a really scary movie. Let me tell you.
Right, we should comment that for those of you listening, we both have Skinamarink inspired Zoom backgrounds. I have the TV set glowing in terror.
Yep.
And Brian has a happy field with a rainbow and watermarks to indicate that he didn't pay for this image.
There's a sun, there's a little rainbow. I wanted to find a sun that had like a little smiley face on it, but I couldn't find one.
Teletubbies, though.
That's what I was hoping to do. I just couldn't find like the perfect one, but
right.
Yeah.
But welcome everyone to this episode where we're talking about our N for new in our miniseries run here for spooky stuff, and we're talking about Skinamarink, a very new film that came out back in January. But before we get into that movie, we haven't talked about this really that much, despite we're going to be reaching halfway through the miniseries by the end of this episode. Brian, what scares you? What scares you in horror movies? Are you often scared by horror, especially of the newer variety?
Not really, to be honest. I'm not really... I don't get scared by movies that often. But sometimes a movie comes along. And so I guess what scares me in movies really is this, right? The sort of... we talked about it last season when we did the Blair Witch Project, that like just the feeling of something being in the dark. And there may be nothing, but there could be something. And that is like just terrifying to me. And this is sort of one of the things that scares me like the most in like, not just in movies, in life. This is, I mean, it is mainly stuff like this. A movie I kind of watched pretty recently that kind of did a similar thing was, Sinister. Is that the one, the Scott Derrickson one with, Ethan Hawke?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, that has a lot of like Ethan Hawke, walking around his house and it's dark and that it's very scary to me. That is what I find so scary. What do you find? What scares you in horror movies? I'm very curious.
Well, that's the thing, because like we both have this mutual background of we were both scaredy cats as children.
Yes.
And then went back on the horror train. Especially me, I went very hard on the horror range of things. Yeah. And especially when I have a history where like the first bit of podcasting I did was a lot of like horror related podcast stuff. So I watched a lot of horror movies, and especially when you do something like that, you often get jaded. And I've seen that a lot, especially in sort of like horror fan communities. It's just like, oh, this isn't that scary. Oh, this, like, especially when a movie gets hyped up a lot around, like, festivals, like, maybe, say, I don't know, the movie we're talking about today, horror fans tend to get very defensive, and I've even been guilty of that to some extent, especially when I was younger, of just like, oh, let's see how scary this is, buddy, yeah, sure, well, that wasn't that scary, but, like, oftentimes, when I watch a horror movie, I kind of forgive, like, look, I haven't really been that scared by a horror movie in a while. Like, I'm not expecting every horror movie to, like, make me shiver in my bones as much as like, is there interesting atmosphere, practical effects, even just the stuff that like really works for the sort of horror fiend in me. But I remember when I was younger, it was a lot of what Skinamarink is feeding on, which is just like that sense of the unknown, of the dark, and what lies there. and especially when you're sort of at an innocent point where you don't really know what's going on. There's that whole thing where, like, I remember so vividly of the Blockbuster era, where, like, I would never go past that horror section, or lest I see some terrifying things. Like, there's a movie called Jack Frost, which is about a killer snowman, and specifically the cover art is of the snowman initially looking like a snowman, but then it's holographic because it was the late 90s. So if you walk past it, he turned into a scary snowman. And I was, like, terrified by that. Just incongenible. Like, what could possibly be here? And then, you know, about a decade or so later, I saw Jack Frost, and that movie sucks. It is not scary at all.
Yeah, I'm looking at the poster right now, and I could see, is it where he looks like a skull, kind of, and he's got like green eyes?
Yes.
Yeah, this is, I if I was walking past this, I would think it was scary.
Well, especially if it transformed from, like, Happy Snowman to that. With the holographic stuff.
Now, I'm also seeing a poster here for Jack Frost 2, The Revenge of the Mutant Killer Snowman. And this poster is very fun. He's got sunglasses up here above, like, on his forehead.
Right.
He's got, like, what would you call that? The sort of, like, Hawaiian, like...
Oh, the lei? Right,
yeah,
yes.
Yeah, he's got one of those. But, yes.
But that often happens, right? Where, like, you would see, like, your imagination as a child conjures up so much other stuff than ultimately what the filmmakers even had in mind.
Yes, a similar experience I had, I guess, was I remember I had seen this horror movie that was, I knew it was a Halloween movie, like the Michael Myers franchise,
right?
And there is this shot in one of them of like a hospital, and you see sort of from the perspective of inside looking outside the window, and, like, Michael Myers is just standing there in, like, the field. And I saw that as a kid, and it was the most terrifying thing in the world to me. And then flash forward to, like, a few months ago, I'm watching all of the Halloween movies, and that shot is in Halloween 5, which is an awful movie.
The most terrifying one, though, clearly. So spooky.
Yeah, but it is that funny thing of, when you're a kid, you're like, this is so terrifying, and then you're an adult, and it's ridiculous and so silly.
Right, especially remember that a lot in terms of, like, which is very important to this particular movie, sort of the channel surfing. When, like, you're like, flipping through channels, like, all of a sudden, something spooky, and you just imagine, especially, like, I remember when I was a kid, I saw this horrific sort of, like, small creature kind of thing that, like, upset me, which is, like, and I ended up being the first leprechaun. Which, when I was little, like, that Warwick Davis makeup, it's terrifying, it's horrible. And then when you watch the full Leprechaun movie, it's like, this is the most ridiculous bullshit that nothing could ever... Like, it never really feels like your imagination is on par with, like, what a lot of these, like, sort of trashier horror directors make. But I feel like that's a bit different with Skinamarink here, which you might as well get into. Here's a bit of the trailer for Skinamarink.
In this house, in this house, in this house, in this house, in this house.
So Skinamarink came out earlier this year, January 13th, 2023, though it had some festival screenings, which is very key to sort of the success of this film. From writer-director Kyle Edward Ball. And if you don't know what this movie is, it might be a bit hard to describe it, because it's not a traditional narrative to any degree. I'm very curious how this discussion will go, because this is definitely the most experimental and weird movie we've covered. in terms of like there's not a very thorough plot. There's a clothesline of a plot, but then the sequence, yes, but then the sequence of events are definitely very much. It's a lot of these two kids who are sort of our protagonists, Kevin and Kaylee, who are in this house in 1995, and they're roughly like between the ages of 3 and 6.
I think one of them is 4, one of them is 6. I think is what
right.
it says in the
Right. So we mainly see a lot through their perspective. Where at the very beginning, there's indication that like, oh, Kevin like fell and had an incident, and his father's on the phone with somebody, and then the next day, he has left the house, and their mother is also missing, not in the picture for some reason. And then while these kids are hanging around the house by themselves, it seems like there's some sort of entity that's there with them that ends up making the windows and doors disappear to the outside. So these kids are just kind of like living on their own, as they can't go outside, can't get any kind of help, and there's something there saying things to them, and they don't want to go upstairs. They want to stay downstairs with the TV.
Yeah. And the whole time they're watching old like Fleischer cartoons on the TV,
public domain stuff. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, and what none of that description I think like gives you though is how weird this movie is made and how it looks and how it feels. I mean, like it is kind of made to look like that sort of fuzzy analog 90s like what would you call that? Like
well, I mean, there's like artificial film grain, which I would argue even just trying to make it look a bit older than the 90s. It feels very much like sort of, you picked up a cursed tape.
Yeah, like more of a tape. Yes.
Right.
But so much of I think the movie is steeped in like 90s stuff. Like, the TV is a very 90s looking TV.
It's the big boxy kind of thing, not flat screen kids. Back in the day, we needed more junk in the trunk for our televisions in order for them to work.
It's a very cool looking like CRT TV.
Yeah.
But just the rhythm of this thing, the editing of it, and just the way it looks is so bizarre. I mean, how would you describe the sort of the rhythm of this thing?
Building dread. Just pure building of dread on a sensory level. I think that's the big thing, is that this feels kind of like, if you can remember, like, to sort of like around that age, like 3 or 4, when you start getting your first kind of like permanent memories, and just that feeling where like, this place is your house, and during the day, like, your parents walk around there, and your sister's like going over to the kitchen, all that other stuff. You eat in that kitchen, you watch TV here in the living room, you go upstairs and go to bed. All that stuff is like here. But then when the dark hits it, your imagination runs wild, and you're unsure of like what's going on. So it very much feels like it's like built from that perspective, and it feels oddly sort of like both impersonal and hugely personal at the same time, because we're kind of objective observers, and we don't ever see these. Well, we do see one of their faces at one point.
Like half of it. It's like from like the side.
Well, no, I mean, no. There's another one where we see their face, but it's a bit different. Some things have been taken
my God,
away. So you don't really see the kids that much, yet there are protagonists, and it's this weird kind of thing where we should mention this movie was made in such fascinating terms, where its budget is $15,000.
Yep.
And Kyle Edward Ball shot this all in his childhood home in Canada. Like we said, it's digital, but also it kind of has sort of the feel almost like a closed circuit TV thing, where the camera like go from one side to the other, or the way it moves. It feels kind of mechanical, but also at the same time, like we said, very intimate in its own weird way.
Yeah, there are times when you get shots like that where it moves like like that left to right sort of thing, and then there's times where he will focus on like a corner for like what feels like an eternity, and then there are shots in it that are like handheld, like POV shots, but most of the movie is like a still shot of like a hallway or like a door or a part of a wall, and it's just that, and yet there is such a palpable like tension, obviously, and there's such a like a creepiness to it. But this movie it has a bit of a vibe going for it, I will say.
This is what the kids would call a vibes movie. Maybe
I mean, I think so, because as much as this movie I think is very like giving you that feeling of like there might be something right there in front of you in the dark that you can't see, and it's even kind of like showing you a dark hallway, and almost like it's almost like the movie's inviting you to like lean forward and like to try and see if there's something there. And you get those moments where you're of kind of full dread, where like, you know, something is clearly happening, things are, you know, going bad, but then there's a lot of moments of like almost a calm dread, I would call it, where like things are very calm and very like, you know, everything's have settled, but there is like something's out there, and it's a weird kind of almost a coziness, I think, where like I find myself kind of getting into the mood of like this fucking oppressive, like dark movie.
You put on a sweater, had a cocoa.
Yeah, but like, yeah, it's a very interesting, weird, sensorial experience that I had with this movie.
Right. A big reason why I kind of wanted to cover this movie is that it is extremely divisive.
Yes.
People either kind of love or hate. We even, our guest last week, Adam, talked about how he did not like the movie necessarily.
Yes, yeah.
Which I've noticed, especially a lot of sort of like older folks are just like, you know, not to be ageist to any degree, but it feels like a lot of older people like, I don't know what the kids are so obsessed about. Because the big thing about this movie was that because it was premiered at Fantasia and a couple other places, and there was a weird error when they were putting out like screeners for critics that allowed the movie to be online briefly, and visible to everybody, and got like downloaded, and a lot of it like passed around on, especially TikTok clips were shown. Like
yes,
some of
the TikTok.
the TikToks, yes. And so the youths were immediately just like, oh, I gotta see this. And I saw this in its weird theatrical run earlier this year, which we should mention was like for a week, roughly, for some reason.
I could not imagine seeing this in a theater. Like, genuinely. I
Right. Couldn't like pause it and like,
yes,
get up
I
or
would
anything,
be it would be just so bad for I would be having a panic attack in the corner. Like,
Well, it's interesting because like when I went and saw this, it was definitely just like, oh shit, it's playing here. I better, because it's only for a week, I better go see it. And
Sure,
it was
yeah.
in one of the smaller theaters at our local theater, and admittingly, it was like half packed, which I was surprised by, honestly. They ended up which we should mention, like this movie costing $15,000 made $2 million in that weekend, which is insane.
pretty good.
That's
Yeah.
a really good return on investment. But yeah, so I was in that audience, and people seemed hyped. Especially there was a whole row that was full of like these young 20-somethings who looked like, yeah, we're about to get scared. We've seen the TikToks. We're very excited to see like this whole movie. And
Right.
there was this weird thing where that crowd clearly did not like the movie. They weren't like being over like, this is bullshit, boo, hiss.
Right,
But
right.
just the vibe, you could tell that people were kind of like looking around, kind of like, what's happening? Are we going to get something at some point? And by the end of it, they were all like, they kind of left in a disappointed mood. Meanwhile, I'm in the back corner, terrified. I can't emphasize enough how Skinamarink just got to me on a weird sort of like lizard brain terror level, because I don't know, I don't know how many of the kids these days can relate to this, but I have very early memories of being young, not having a TV in my room, so I wanted to sneak in and watch some like late cartoons on like Cartoon Network or something. So I had to make that
right.
trek from like my bedroom, like all the way in the back of my childhood home, through like the hallways, past my parents' room, all the way over through the kitchen to the living room.
Did you have a 2-story house though?
No, I didn't. Actually.
Okay, good, because that is the part that makes this movie so terrifying.
But still, at the same time, I did feel a sense of dread from that. Even like I remember staying over at people's houses who had stairs, and still being
Yeah.
terrified of just like going down or up and like
Yeah.
missing something. But anyway, so like I have very vivid memories, especially of like a big TV that's the only sort of source of light, and like just even looking over the side, like is something there? No, I got like keep watching. I don't know, a Yogi Bear rerun at like 3 a.m. or whatever I was watching at that point. And yeah, just it really digs into that kind of thing we were mentioning earlier of just like looking into blackness and your imagination running wild and being fearful of like is something there that's out to kill me.
Yeah.
And it's still fucked up to me.
Yeah, I do love as well like the fact that the TV is basically the only source of light in the movie, except for like there's a few like lights that get turned on and off. But once things really get going and like this entity thing has like full control of the house, like it's basically just the TV and then like a flashlight that one of the children has. But what I was thinking of earlier as well was like, you know, you were talking about your theatrical experience, how everyone didn't like it and like was kind of, you know, waiting for sort of something to happen. And that is a part of the movie, I think, is that like, you know, it's kind of one of those things where you watch a movie that's billed as like the scariest movie ever, but it's still a movie you have to watch. Like there is still like, you know, and sort of getting at the root of this movie, it's very interesting because like, yeah, so much of it is not a lot's happening, and you know, you'll see a wall and you'll see a door, and that's really it. And again, that is kind of part of that sort of almost coziness feeling for me I had getting into this, where like waiting for that sort of next scare, I was kind of like just obsessed with the the framing of all of these shots in the movie, but also the fuzziness of like just the analog, you know, obviously some like filters and stuff, but they're pretty good filters, I think, sort of you know, on in this movie. But yeah, it's so unsettling in so many ways.
I think the big thing, which I read an interview that Ball did for Roger Ebert, and he said like the main thing he really wanted to come across is like the sound, because
Yeah.
like with a lot of other movies he talked about like that take place in sort of like a past era, they have like cleaner sound, which kind of ruins the illusion for him, as opposed to here, even though it is recorded digitally, it's muffled in an interesting way where you can kind of make certain things out. There are subtitles occasionally, sometimes not. I did love initially I watched this on Shudder and I had like the subtitles on, and it's a lot of just like feet on scrunching
Yeah.
on floor.
Rustles,
Rustles, yeah.
footsteps walking away, footsteps getting closer, like
Yeah, you're not going to get any of all of the dialogue that isn't subtitled with the Shudder's subtitles.
yeah, but I love that about the movie though. I love that sort of lo-fi quality of it, and especially with horror, because like it's so easy. It would have been so easy for him to shoot this like with an iPhone or something like that, but you wouldn't have gotten that same kind of, you know, the same vibe that you get from this because of a lot of the technical aspects of it. But yeah, I really love just the sound of it and the way that dialogue is handled, where there's not really any conversations that happen really. There's like very short ones, briefly between the kids. It's such a disorienting experience. It yeah.
Yeah, especially when there's a lot of the sequences where the kids are talking, you don't see any part of them. Like there's one bit
Yeah.
where like the kids are talking to each other about like, can we sleep down here tonight? And
Yeah.
sure, and it's like that adds enough, because I think the barrier a lot of people have is like, oh, these people aren't like characters. We don't really get the full investment we would in your average movie with them. But I think we get like just enough of them to where they're great like audience surrogates. And
Yeah.
like it's true audience surrogates where it's like they are just like enough of characters to where like you were a kid, right? You've been this small and you've talked in this particular way at a certain point where the kid, like especially the fact that the kids that they use have such like natural voices. Lucas Paul and Daly Rose Tetralot, they have like such naturalistic voices that feel just like, oh, these are actual children saying these things,
Yeah.
as opposed to like, you know, a Hollywood kid actor who's a bit more polished.
Yeah, and all the voice lines that the kids have are so like they add to the sort of dread because they sound like just normal little kids. And just the shots where it is like most of the shots of people walking are of their like legs, like you see the bottom half of the kids. You never really see their faces really, and the movie doesn't give you a lot to sort of cling on to there. And like it will go long stretches without even showing you either of the kids necessarily, and you're kind of like, what's going on, like what happened, and then it'll cut back to one of them like sleeping or something, and it's like, okay, nothing bad's happening yet, but it has almost that dreamlike quality obviously it feels more like a nightmare, but that sort of dreamlike quality of like it's calm, things aren't happening, and then things really pick up.
Well, especially that it's like you're in a familiar place, but something's off about it.
Exactly. Yes, and a lot of that stuff, like the scenes where they go into like the parents' room, is one of the most horrifying things I've seen. Like,
so in case it wasn't clear at all, based on some of these things you've been saying, you did enjoy Skinamarink because you were very nervous going into this. You were very.
I
worried,
was.
Even though our patrons, shout out to our patrons, patreon.com/cinema2letter, ended up picking this one for this episode. So you were very nervous going into
I was.
This.
Yeah, just because I, as someone who doesn't get scared by horror movies that often.
As a big boy pants.
Yeah, I tie my shoes by myself, and but this one I was like, okay, this might provoke, this might stir up some very primal fears for me, and it did, and I have tried not to think about it over like the past couple of days, because I'm just like, if I think about this when I'm trying to go to bed, I will not sleep. It is scary, but I think more I was impressed by the craft of it and the technical aspects of it. Again, I just love the rhythm of this thing, the way it moves, how slow it is, how Kyle Edward Ball is not really interested in like putting a narrative onto this. There is no like explanation or scene where they explain that like, oh, actually it was a ghost, and it's someone who died in this house like in the 80s or whatever. I guess this is the 90s, so it would be like someone who died in like the 50s or whatever. But not really. And I like how it is not really interested in providing answers and is more interested in like just fucking scaring the shit out of you for an hour and 40 minutes.
Right, and doing so with admittingly, like, sometimes there's, like, some jump scares. There's some bits where, like, something will, like, pop up and scare you. Jump scares get a bad rap, I think.
I think so,
because it just sort of became, like, the internet excuse of just, like, oh, a horror movie just overuses this. Especially after the internet, I think, ironically made the worst version of that with, like, the early jump scare pop-ups. Like, you'd get emails and shit. Or, like, the worst offenders of those. You just watch the car as it's going around the track. And, spooky.
It's like an exorcist lady thing, like whatever, yeah.
Right, but as opposed to here, where, like, Kyle Edward Ball knows that, like, okay, you're expecting a scare, and you're gonna get one, but the much more terrifying sort of thing is the creepiness. He talks about this a lot in that interview I was referring to, where he feels that, like, scary is a lot more ephemeral, but creepiness lasts. And I think that's very accurate to, like, this movie where, like, admittedly, whenever something, like, pops up, like the fucking phone, or little Kaylee's face without eyes and a mouth and shit, stuff like that is like terrifying. It's one of these rare movies where like I get scared in the way I remember distinctly as a kid, where like I would get scared and just be paralyzed with fear for a bit, for like 15 seconds, just like oh god, and that happened even watching it this time. Where I had like the interesting experience, folks, of I was like, okay, I want to try and recreate the immersive experience I had in the theater. So I watched it, like, at the end of the night, and I had, like, all my laptop was over there, my phone was, like, locked, and I was like, okay, I'm not gonna look at anything, I'm gonna watch it. And the first half of it I watched, and had that same sense of dread, all the way up until the scene where Kaylee goes up to the parents' room, through all of that. And I was like, I can't fucking handle this, I need to stop. I need to turn the lights on. I need to watch, like, a funny comedy video. I can't handle this. And I went to sleep, somehow, after all that. I'm a big boy. I was a very brave boy. and ended up going to sleep after that. But then I woke up a bit earlier before work and finished the movie. In broad daylight, I heard birds chirping, and I had my dog next to me.
It looked like my Zoom background.
Right, it looked like your Zoom background, yes. And I was still just transfixed by it. I was still terrified by it the whole time. I was just like, Jesus Christ. This is still just like, it's a weird thing where like a lot of people have said like, oh, you gotta be in the right mindset to like be immersed in the movie. And that helps. But at the same time, I would argue, even without that kind of like enclosure of a theater, I was still just like constantly hooked by it. Just looking for every like nook and cranny, just like, even after seeing the movie earlier, I still just had this time of like, all right, when's it gonna show up? I forgot the order. I don't know when the phone thing happens. I don't know when her face shows up. Just like, and I had that weird kind of like, I'm sure a lot of people who watch this are watching like, okay, let's see something. I've been seeing this corner for a while, or this black void. Like, see me, show me something. Come on. And I had the weird kind of like other thing where I'm like, all right, Kyle, motherfucker, come on, show it. Show it. I'm a brave boy. Come on, I can face it. Come on, just do it. For the love of God, just do it. I had that kind of thing. That kind of like, it's the being of that hideous heart, kind of like building dread that was immersing in me. And it's like, it's so rare a movie can make me feel like that. And I'm so glad something like that exists.
Yeah, I mean, like, in contrast, I watched this at 3 p.m.
Right.
The windows were open, but like the blinds were like, drawn, so like there was, it was a little dark, but even still, yeah, watching it in the daytime, it still is a movie like you said, transfixing. Like, it's so, you just want to watch it even though it's scaring you. It's that thing about horror where you just like, you want to keep watching it and you want to see what happens. And at least for me, as someone who loves like, the like slow cinema, I love the fact that this movie doesn't really show you a lot for most of its runtime. And I do think that like it's a little long. I think it's an hour 40 minutes, and like I do think that you can only get so much with that. And I started to feel a bit tired when like towards the end, when he's sort of doing the same thing of like, we're gonna hang on this shot for 5 minutes. My mind did start to kind of wander a bit and kind of, do that whole thing. But I mean, really, there's nothing else like this that I've seen. And like, I'm not a huge like horror fan who like watches like a ton of, everything. Like, I'm not one of those people, but I watch enough, horror movies out there, and there's just nothing I've seen like this, really, where not just in like the feelings that it evokes, right? Because very few movies do that. Another one is like the Blair Witch Project, but also just in like the way it's made. And I love that aspect of it. And I was like, more than anything, I was like, oh, he's a really good director, and his framing on all of these shots are really incredible. And yeah, it's such a unique movie.
Now, given, there's so much it's very experimental, it's up for interpretation, do you have any like take on what this movie represents? Do you have any take on like what sort of this story as it is actually like unfurling in front of you? If there's any detail you kind of like gleaned from it?
I guess my interpretation of things, which is like, I'm also just willing to accept that like this movie's not giving you anything like at all. And I love that. I love that aspect of it. And but my interpretation of it is that it is just an entity, like an evil. I don't think it is like a ghost or a spirit. I think it is like just an evil entity, and it is like just taking over this house. It is like, it's such an effective like haunted house story in a way that I like many haunted house movies have not really gotten me. Like, this creates the most dread out of a haunted house that I've like ever seen in a movie, maybe. Yeah, I sort of view it as that, just a very dark, twisted haunted house movie. I don't know. Yeah, do you have any like interpretation of your own?
Well, I mean, I've seen a lot of interesting ones, like some who sort of like equate the entity to like another kid who's like forcing these kids to play with them, because the ghost constantly says like, I want to play, and it's sort of like,
yeah,
essentially treating these kids like they're in a dollhouse, being like thrown about and doing like horrible things to them, especially like putting the knife in the eye and stuff like that.
There's that shot of like it's like the house, like it shows you the house, and it's like in this big room. Do you know what I'm talking about? That shot towards the end, kind of.
Right. Yes. Of like the little like it looks like a children's drawing of the house, even.
Yeah, and it's like in this like big room, and that kind of it's very, very unsettling to see that. Yeah.
Right. But I would say my thing is that it feels a bit more like this malevolent entity is somehow kind of feeding off the sort of what I interpret the kind of relationship the kids have to their parents who are not there. Is that it feels like it feels like a big metaphor for child abuse to me, because it's so much about like earlier on we get the whole thing where it's like we hear the father on the phone just like, oh, he fell down the stairs and he was like sleepwalking. That's what Kaylee told me, which almost feels like somebody making stuff up. And then he ends up leaving and sort of ends up giving this sort of like neglect to these kids. Like this person has shirked their responsibilities, been horrible to them, and then left. And then what these kids are trying to like fend off is basically like both like the PTSD of having like these abusive, like at least an abusive dad, and maybe a mom who's just like not there anymore. Maybe dad killed her, that maybe she left like earlier, leaving these kids to this abusive father. And these kids just have to kind of deal with like that PTSD, but also a demon, which is like rough. These kids have had a rough early couple of years. And I think it adds like this interesting kind of tragedy where it's like it's about just that basic thing of like your parents aren't there and you're small, you don't know how the world works, and there's something there that you don't know. And I think that additional stuff kind of like helps to like sort of, especially I found that from like the second viewing, that kind of, or even especially like child neglect angle. But at the same time, it also just like that, even that basic interpretation, like there is an entity there that is like fucking with these kids, still works on its own without any of that additional sort of backstory stuff. But I kind of gleaned that, especially like the stuff with the mom in that bedroom, it feels like somebody who's like afraid to be in their home because there is some evil force there.
Yeah.
Which feels kind of like, I'm discussing fun things on this show.
This is a fun, lighthearted movie, I think.
Well, that's true, right? A lot of laughs.
Yeah, real gut buster.
Right. I mean, there are cartoons in it. They're so wacky.
The cartoons look fun. I kind of, like I would watch those cartoons. But, yeah, and what I love is that, like, you can pick so much out of this. Like, you can. Like, that interpretation, like, it reads. But yet, like, if someone else came to me and was, like, gave me a completely different one, I'm sure it is. Because, like, I'm sure it would be fair because this movie is so open-ended. And, like, even I'm not really entirely sure what ends up happening to them. It's very, like, they get, like, eaten, right? Basically, it's or something like that. It's so, there's that shot of like it's at the end when like the demon's like eating, and it sounds like he's like eating the kids. It's and like you see like the blood splatter. It's so, it's so horrifying.
Yeah, but even like I'm curious. Then, what is the scariest moment to you? What is like the scariest scene?
It's the end. It's the last shot, basically, right? It's the face.
Yeah.
Terrifying. It's so, because it is so. Again, it's going back to the sort of the craft of it, where you can barely see that there's a face there, like just barely.
Especially like the way it looks, there's almost like kind of like the contours where eyes and like full mouth would be, but it's like there's like the smallest inch of a smile.
Yeah, and like it reminds me a lot, of course, of like a lot of shots from David Lynch's Inland Empire, of course, like just horrifying faces. A very similar movie, I think, by the way.
There's a lot of Lynch, I would argue, even beyond Inland Empire in this.
Yeah, but that face is just is a great also ending, because it's giving you sort of something. It's giving you confirmation that, like, yes, there is something out there, but that's it, and you can take from that what you will.
Especially when like the last lines that are there are like the little Kevin kid saying, what's your name? What's your name? And you don't get an answer. That face might as well just be Kyle Edward Ball, just like, that's it, everybody. Good night.
Yeah, that's all, folks. And they do like... dun, 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 dun. But what is your scariest moment? Is it also the face, or do you have another one?
I think there are a lot. But I think for me, it's got to be that scene I mentioned earlier with Kaylee going up to the parents' room. Just the dread of like her walking around, seeing the bottom half of her dad sitting on the side. We never see the full visage of her dad. It's just his legs. And he just says like, look under the bed.
Look under the bed.
Look under the bed. Like, nope. Not doing that. And the genius of like, nothing is under the bed. They look twice. They look twice and nothing's there. Even I love like the Kaylee comes up and just like, I don't see anything. Look again. Oh god, we're going back. And then but then gets up and then looks over. Oh, her dad's gone, but her mom is on the other side of the bed. And just the way that she very deliberately speaks, just like, I need you to, and like the subtitles show up, and then close your eyes pop up, just like, oh nope. Nope, not. And then just even the way that like how abrupt the ending of that scene is, where like she looks over to the side, she hears crunching noises, her mom says something's there, and then a scream happens and like, oh, we're back downstairs. That's over now.
That cut is so abrupt, and there's like there is this loud like whiny noise, like a ear kind of noise as well, kind of this lo-fi like like clang. It is so it's so effective. That's one of the moments that kind of made me like audibly gasp at like, oh my god, this is like because watching it, I think I had a bit of that feeling as kind of hypnotized by it as I was like also a bit like, is this a movie that's gonna have actual scares, or is it gonna be like one of these like elevated horror kind of like things where like
it's really
not
about
a lot
trauma.
happens. Yes.
Right.
Yes. Like, or is it going to have actual scares? And there are actual scares there.
What do you feel maybe separates this in terms of like the actual scares from like the average horror movie? What do you think like makes like those scary moments actually work as viscerous as opposed to like, a Blumhouse or a more typical A24 trauma horror?
I think part of it is the build up to it, how much time you spend, just looking at a TV or just looking at a wall, and it is those quiet moments really amplify those like that scene you said. Like I think that scene works as effective as it does because you're getting sort of small breadcrumbs of like, hey, there's something kind of creepy about this house right now. But I think that's the moment where you're fully sort of in this like terror. I think it is that sort of the rhythm of like where a lot of horror movies can do I don't even have a problem with jump scares, but it is like the cheap version of the jump scare or
the cat scare. Is what I always think of.
Yeah.
Walking down a hallway. Oh no, something's there. It's like meow, and then it, like, runs away. Yeah.
Or it's like their friend getting their attention, like putting their hand on their shoulder. And, oh, you scared me. Like but I think that is what separates this movie is that it has a lot of those calm moments where like, nothing is happening. Like nothing. There's no dialogue. There's nothing. You hear the music and from the TV, and that's it. And also like just the craft of it and just the way it's directed. I think that's what just really makes it so unique.
It kind of trains you to sort of like let your mind wander with the way that it does that. Because I would say, like you mentioned earlier about like, oh, you kind of started having a bit of fatigue with it near the end. I felt that more during the first like 20 or so minutes when I first watched it, where it's a lot more of just like the kids are walking around, like they go downstairs, dad's there. It's really like, I think the big one that really invests me, sort of in terms of the scares, where it's like things click off, is when the kid goes upstairs to get something, and he's like, oh, I'm kind of scared up here. The nightlight's unplugged. I'm going to plug it back in. And then we just see the shot of the hallway with the darks except the nightlight. And the nightlight disappears. No one's there.
Yeah.
That's where I'm like, oh, something's off. This is weird. This is uncomfortable. And just the fact that it's like you mentioned, sort of the deliberate pacing of it, that allows you to, like, when there are certain shots where literally we're looking into a black void and we see like this digital grain that's trying to replicate the film grain and stuff, it feels just off enough to where, like, I recognize some of these elements. There is a familiarity, but at the same time, I'm seeing, like, a grain over there, and because of the way the film's structured, I see a grain in the corner, I'm like, oh, fuck, is that a thing?
Yeah, yes. There is a shot of, like, a hallway. Again, I don't know, and I'll never watch the movie again because it's terrifying. But, like, I swear I saw, like, a black, like, figure
Right.
of, like, it's one of those things where you're just like, is my mind playing tricks on me, or is this, like, am I just seeing something here? And it's horrifying. It's just it's so creepy.
Especially when contrasted from, like, the cartoons. I think that's the genius thing about the cartoons. Is, like, you have that thing when you're younger, like, you know, like the nightlight thing, or I remember this, like, around the time I got, like, a TV in my room. I was just like, well, whatever is under my bed can't scare me because I have the Muppet Show on, or whatever the hell. This is a protection. This is a shield from any kind of, like, wrongdoing. And then the way that the cartoons turn on them, basically, particularly with the Presto Chango cartoon, which is the one with the rabbit, which, shout out, is actually an early Looney Tunes cartoon that is in public domain.
Oh, cool.
It's directed by Chuck Jones, in fact, and the little bunny is actually the proto Bugs Bunny.
Cool.
Like, this is one of the early ones they did before Bugs Bunny officially debuted later. And that fucking cartoon, when they start repeating the bit where, like, the rabbit makes himself disappear with the hands, and it just, like, keeps looping and looping and looping, and then even, like, the ultimate reveal after that isn't actually scary, but it is still just, like, you're terrified from the moment we change from that. Because, like, it just builds that dread, like, whoop, 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 and then something else, and you're still, like, terrified even though nothing's there.
The repetition of it as well, like, just you seeing it and hearing it over and over again, like, you're just kind of like, what? Come on, what? Like, what are you doing? Come on. And, like, yeah, and that kind of leads to kind of one of those, like, the moment towards the end where the entity is like, I can do anything. And that line is so horrifying, and it's such a simple line, and yet, like, there's so much dread just in that, where you're just like, oh my god, I'm, like, terrified.
But it's a great terrifying that works for, like, any age. Like, when you hear something like scary voices, I want to play, or come upstairs, or particularly, like, the line you were just saying that, like, I can do anything. Like, it just gives you a very, like, primal kind of terror. And I think especially also the way that, like, some of this repetition stuff works, it puts you in the shoes of, like, these kids where, also, it's kind of helped by, like, you know, being not too far away from, like, quarantine, COVID pandemic stuff. It's like, hey, you're stuck in the same place, and the days kind of blur together. And especially just the factor of, like, there are no windows or doors, which is a brilliant way of, like, getting around, like, oh, we have to, like, cover light or whatever. It's like, oh, none of these things are here anymore.
Yeah.
These things are gone. And even, like, a bit of humor with, like, the toilet disappearing, which is cute. And then they have, like, 2 buckets.
There are some funny moments in this movie.
Yeah.
One of the ones that stands out to me, I think, is, like, after you've just, like, had a panic attack, one of the little kids is like, can we watch something happy now? Which is, I think, just so funny.
Right, or even there's something where, like, after I think he goes upstairs for the first time, and you, like, hear, like, entities or whatever, and they're just like, can we sleep downstairs? And stuff like that. It immerses you in the spot the kids are in, where it's just, like, everything, like, because of, like, the movie's, like, it's 100 minutes long, but it feels longer, but not in the way where you're like, oh, come on, can we wrap this up? It's just like, how long have I been here? Has it only been 20 minutes, or has it been an eternity? I don't know. Yeah. I'm scared.
I've seen people, I think a common criticism of this movie is that, like, it could have been a short film.
Right.
And theoretically, I don't, like, disagree, because, like, yeah, enough, like, you could cut this down and it would be a great little 45-minute to an hour short, maybe a bit longer. But I think you would lose just, it's so drawn out. The quote-unquote boring moments are so drawn out.
my favorite thing when people kind of call it like filler episodes for TV shows and shit.
Right.
Where it's
Yeah.
just like, well, whatever. I want plot. I want like 3-act structure and everything.
Yeah.
So it's like I like that too, man. But it's a lot more sort of scary when you don't have sort of like the typical like, oh, there's got to be some kind of explanation for the supernatural entity, and also stuff. It's just like it's just the experience of being in that fucking house.
Yeah, and it feels like, and I read an interview with Ball where he was talking about this, where he wanted it to feel like a nightmare, like in the just the structure of it, and you get so much of that. And you know, another thing I think of as well was you were kind of talking about how like it is these kids being in this place that is familiar because you know your house, but it's at night, and it's also that thing of like when you're a kid, when you're like. Yeah, it feels like your house at night is a completely different like location. Like it might as well be like the fucking like
an abandoned mental asylum or something.
Yeah, like it's just like a completely different place, and it feels like while it's nighttime, it's night, and it's never gonna be day. You know, that kind of creepy feeling where it feels like you're never gonna see this like the daylight again because you're like so scared. And yeah, it's just another feeling that this movie evokes.
Well, especially I just love also the decor of the house.
Yeah.
Where it's just like it feels naturally like a sort of 70s era house that this kid from the 90s grew up in because his parents bought it, like probably from somebody in the 80s, and then they ended up, you know, with these kids in this house where it has like distinctive features like that big wooden sort of like triangle that's right above the TV. And some of like those sort of rock facades a bit with like the sort of the fireplace area and stuff like that. It like looks just enough like a house with a bit of flair, but at the same time feels like it would be affordable for like a middle class environment like the 90s. You feel like you've seen like pictures of your friends in that house kind of thing.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, and so much of like the way that you can tell it looks like a normal house, and yet through the way that the like just all the filters and the way that's being shot, it doesn't feel like a normal house. It doesn't feel like you're moving through a house at times. It feels like you're just in this like weird liminal space that is like weird and dark and twisted.
Right, which it also plays, I think, into a big reason why this kind of became popular. Like, because, you know, I'm down with the kids, Brian. I know what the youths are all about. I'm the Steve Buscemi meme of just like, hello, fellow kids. I'm well aware. But I think there's a whole thing with, like, you know, the sort of the creepypasta, which led into a lot of, like, the liminal space horror. Like, there's that, what's it called, Backrooms, right? Which that kid is now making a movie at, like, 17 or something. And, like, stuff like that where it's like, hey, here's a picture of a small space that has, like, you know, certain contours and stuff that make it feel like this is an enclosure. This is like a trap. Like some entity is trapping me here. And I love how the movie embraces that, but also because of the weird non-specifics of like what this entity is, it kind of implies that like this creature can do anything, not just with that line, but also like the shots where one, you're like upside down, like and on the ceiling, which I'm amazed how the fuck he did those. That's crazy.
Yeah, because they're the one of like all the like Legos and stuff like stuck to the ceiling, and I'm like, okay, I can believe that movie magic. But then there's the part at the end where they're like, he's like walking on the ceiling, and that's the part where I was like, whoa, hold on, this is very impressive.
How the fuck did you spend $15,000? Right, but then like you mentioned, that shot of like all the toys that are like up on the ceiling and like they're all crouched together in the upstairs hallway, and just that little title of 576 days later, or something like that, 527 days, whatever. It's been over a year, basically, they've been in this fucking house.
That's the part, because the movie becomes very disorienting in those last kind of 20 minutes or so, 20, 30 minutes, I would say, where it is so difficult to even, like, pick up on what's happening. And yet, when you get that title card, it is so, like, oh my god, like, kind of feeling, where you're just like, Jesus, this is, like, just so painful.
And they lull you into like that sense of dread right before the telephone, which is like the element of this telephone is so fascinating to me. Where like earlier we get the bit where the boy Kevin is trying to like call, like he manages to like get a line on the phone, like actually tries to call 911. which I think adds a lot to like sort of that abuse theory I have, particularly with just like is someone listening, and can you be a brave boy for me? That
Right. Yes.
where that grounds you in the reality of like, oh my god, this vague image we've seen a few things of and heard, a voice of a child, is a kid, and he's trying to call for help, and there is an adult on the line trying to help them. But even how like the little bits where like the 911 person's reacting, just like, wait, there are no doors and no windows and shit like that, and then the fact that like, oh, the line ends up crashing, and then that this thing has turned the phone into that little Fisher Price phone.
Yeah, the one from like, Toy Story 3.
Right, I'm glad that guy got work. You know, it's been over a decade.
And
I'm glad he got more work.
They didn't. Pixar didn't bring him back for Toy Story 4, so he really had to go to other places for work.
No, he was just waiting by himself for the phone call. But yeah, then like that Fisher Price phone, which everyone had. Like I had that toy. Anybody has got some version of this phone. And then later on, when that phone is just like, I love like it's the flashlight clicking on and off, which is terrifying. Which is like click, click.
Yeah,
click,
and
click.
if I remember correctly, it's the eyes first, right? Like it's
right,
dark.
the lights click off from one shot, and then the eyes are there, and you're like, oh fuck,
and that's the part where you're. And then it cuts to and then the light comes on, and I let out a legitimate like, oh my god.
It's just the phone,
thank
right?
God.
It's just that phone, right? Nothing bad.
It's just the phone. I literally said, it's just the phone from Toy Story 3. Oh, thank God. Like,
and then, phone rings.
Yep. That sort of liminal space kind of thing is really like a big element of this movie. And the weird kind of like, I follow like a Twitter account called like Liminal Spaces that just posts like, yeah. And there is like, you'll see one of them and you'll be like, that's cool. And that's a cool like vibe. And then you'll see another one, and it's just creepy, and just like you're just like, there are some very bad vibes coming from this like picture in this like room, and this movie gets both of those things. I think it is so just distressing, and yet like there is a vibe here. I think it's weird, but
it definitely feels like a movie born from the internet in terms of like some of that liminal space stuff, or even I got a lot of vibes of when I was, especially like about 10 years ago, I was really into like urban explorer videos where they would just go to like, especially like the abandoned Disney things.
Yes. Okay. Yeah.
Like Critter Country and some of these other things where it's just like, oh, let's look into this abandoned place that has a childhood element. Like I remember I watched, like the last time I was really into those was when Disney Quest shut down, and they had a guy like sneaking to Disney Quest. So there's all these shots of him just walking down like these hallways I remember going into Disney Quest. And at the same time, just seeing like, oh, there's a decapitated Buzz Lightyear. Oh, look, here's all these different like just.
I shouldn't laugh. That's so horrible to Buzz Lightyear.
Right, our man Buzz Lightyear, RP to a real one, and like a big Pinocchio face that was on the wall, and she's just like walking down like a dark hallway, and then there's just something familiar, but in this cascaded light that looks upsetting, and I think like that's really evoked here with so much of it, like. Even there's a shot that isn't at all explained during like sort of this it's after like Kaylee has had her face removed. We get that shot, but then before like the initial like put knife in your eye, where there's just a shot of the back of a woman's head.
Yeah.
And there's no like, even with the minimal amount of like sort of connection this movie has, there's no explanation for that shot. And Kyle Ball has said like, I know who that is. I'm not telling anybody. It's like, who the fuck is that? What the fuck is that thing?
Yeah.
Why is, and especially just that like the scariest sort of thing where like the back of a person's head, but you don't see the shoulders, you just see the hair, and it's like anything could be hiding that fucking hair, dude. Anything could be behind that face.
Yeah, like, and what you were saying earlier, like this feels like something born out of the internet. It also reminds me of another kind of recent horror movie, which is We're All Going to the World's Fair, and sort of in terms of like, yeah, it has kind of an internet fuzziness to it. I don't know how to explain it, and like parts of this feel like they kind of are from that like creepypasta kind of thing, but I think like you were saying earlier with those like internet stuff, like this never does the thing where it will show you like, it shows you a creepy face, but it like obfuscates it behind so many layers of like fuzz and grain and everything that it's like barely discernible. Whereas like those videos would be like, like right in your face. And I think that is what separates something like that kind of just dumb internet stuff from this, which I think is a real, like, genuinely fascinating piece of art.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot, especially in terms of like, because creepypasta feels very hit or miss for me. Because there are some that are like so clear, like this is written by a 12-year-old and it's not nearly as scary as I want it to be. But it reminds me particularly of there's the one Candle Cove, which was the first. They turned that into the first season of that Channel Zero show, which I watched. But
Okay.
that story where basically it's about like a group of people, like it was told via like message board sort of things, where it's like two people talking about like, hey, remember that show Cabin Cove when we were kids? That had like little puppets and stuff, and like nobody really, like in the message board, no one's like, I don't remember this show. I don't remember the show either. And then like the very end message, as like they tell a bunch of like increasingly upsetting stories about like what happens on the show, in this fictional children's show. And then the very end, you're just like, yeah, I remember one time my mom just said like you would just watch that TV for 30 minutes when it was just static. Yep.
It's like creepy.
Right, that's creepy. But in a way that
Yeah.
feels like it's tied to sort of like kind of like a childhood nostalgia, but at the same time this is not a movie that very much is like, oh, you remember this about your childhood, but it's not some cartoon you watched or some emotion you have tied to like playing on the playground. It's that fear, and that's just like a thing that not a lot of people want to go back to necessarily. Not a lot of people can like go back into that particular kind of element of it, but I think that's it's so fascinating to see that as like a counterbalance to where like 90s nostalgia feels so much more like crass and oversold
Yeah.
by like a month, and even 80s nostalgia was doing that, particularly like a decade ago into now. But this feels like definitely the anti-nostalgia, just like, remember when you felt fucking terrified and unsure about things as a kid?
Yeah.
In a different way than you do right now.
Yeah. This is a very like just the sort of the haunted version of only 90s kids will remember this.
Yes.
Like it is like, yeah, only this is what the 90s were like. Fucking horrifying. Like just terrifying.
Only 90s kids will wet their pants in this particular moment.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, is there anything we haven't brought up that you want to shout out about Skinamarink before we get into like final thoughts and stuff? Any lingering things?
Yeah, I never thought that so many shots of Lego could be this like, hypnotizing, but
For the record, very impressed with that little Lego city those kids built.
They
Very
were,
impressed
yeah.
with Lego City.
Look, I'm getting into Legos for like a separate reason in my personal life, but maybe want to build some Legos.
I want to build a Lego city. I can do it better than those children can.
Yeah.
I don't even have an entity following me. Fuck you, kids. I can do it way better.
They should have a Skinamarink Lego set.
Oh, right.
I don't know what that would include, but I think it'd be cool.
Just vague shapes that you assemble.
Yeah,
The instructions are just like a big question mark.
it's like it's the upside down house. Like the when the room's upside down, you have to build it upside down.
Right, of course, yes. One thing I just wanted to shout out is something I remember being confused by at the beginning, and I just found out about the dedication at the beginning. At the very beginning,
Yeah.
like at the end of the opening credits, there's a dedication to a guy named Joshua Buchholter, and they say that like this movie couldn't have been made without the help of Joshua Buchholter's family. And Joshua Buchholter was the assistant director on the film, and he was quite young, and he suddenly died, like right before post-production started. And the thing was, he not only was the assistant director, but he recorded all of the audio that you hear in the movie.
Oh wow!
And it was all on his laptop. So Kyle Edward Ball had to be like, after some grieving, had to like, hey, can I get the laptop from you guys so I can use it like to his family? And it's a shame, of course, that guy passed away, but especially considering what he contributes to this movie with that sound is like so crucial. Like it is such like
it is.
a firm element where it's not even just like the way the dialogue's recorded, where like you mentioned you kind of made the impression at the start of this with like the way that the entity talks like this.
Like that, yeah.
Yes, like that tinniness kind of affects it, but also even just the hisses that we hear during like those black moments, where there's just like nothing there, and you hear like a hiss.
It's just it's like white noise almost.
Yeah.
And it's like menacing white noise.
It's so crucial to getting you invested in this, where it's just like
It is.
I'm stuck here, and there's a hissing. There's something here. I didn't pause the movie. It's still going.
I mean, like, yeah, if it had just been this and without any of the sort of technical aspects of it, would have been scary. But I think, yes, it does so much for the movie, and it really like is what sells the movie, like, just sells it home. And what really works about this movie is how both the visuals of it, but the sound and the soundscape create. It makes it the sensory experience where like I kept like almost wanting to turn it up because like it was like, am I gonna hear something? Am I gonna like
But
be
then,
able to just
a jump scare happens. You're like, nope, nope, turn it down, turn it
yeah
down.
yeah and yeah, just that lo-fi sort of like aesthetic that it has, where it's like, yeah, the tinniness, the sort of like the like droning almost. It's something I really love.
Also, just a shout. Do you know what Skinamarink even is? Where that comes from?
I saw the quote from what he had said, but I don't remember what it was. Isn't it like a musical?
It's a song.
A song,
Like it's
okay.
It's a song I remember from childhood. Like if you hear, I remember very vividly like going to preschool, and there was some show where it was like two kids and like a guy dressed up in like a bear costume, and they sang the song was like Skinamarink-a-dink-a-dink, Skinamarink-a-doo, I love you. So it's a very childish song, but
Right.
it's kind of a genius title, even though they don't use that song in the movie. It's still just like, it's weird enough to where like this feels like a childhood kind of like made up word, but at the same
Yeah.
time there's kind of a this unnervingness with like the K's. He said that very much like the sort of the hard K sounds of skin a rink.
Yeah.
Just like it kind of offsets you.
It is a great title. Like
Yeah.
it's very fun to say. It's very like memorable. It somehow the movie evokes it, like you were saying, that sort of childhood feeling, and how it just twists it into this dark, fucked up movie.
But even like the clinicalness of the first half of it being skin,
Yeah.
like unnerving, and then a rink. What's this silly thing?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's, yeah. Well, that is our discussion then on Skinamarink. I'm very curious if you all watched this movie in prep, if any of you liked it or not. I'd be very curious to hear how many of you actually dug Skinamarink. But let's get into our usual segment, Between the Lines. So on every episode for Between the Lines, Brian and I talk about another movie we kind of recommend to you out there that's related to some degree to the movie we're talking about. Either it could be like another N for New choice, for example, or it could be something tangentially related to the movie itself, Skinamarink. So, Brian, you're going first here. What is your pick for Between the Lines this week?
Yeah. My choice is another horror movie, another recently released horror movie in the past 3 years. A movie I think about all the time. I talk about it any chance I get. I'm talking about David Pryor's The Empty Man. This movie. So, for one, this is directed by David Pryor, who has worked very closely with David Fincher, I believe. He has worked on various of his films.
Yeah, a lot of behind-the-scenes kind of EPK stuff for Fincher movies.
Yes,
And particularly,
yeah.
like if you any of the behind-the-scenes stuff for like Fight Club or Zodiac, stuff like that.
Yeah. And it is, at its most basic level, is a movie about James Badge Dale, who is a like retired detective, and he gets embroiled into this sort of small town kind of mystery about a disappearing girl. This like his neighbor's daughter has gone missing. It may be tied to this thing of the empty man, which is this like folklore that's told, and yet the movie is so much more than that, and it is, for one, a very long movie at about almost 2.5 hours.
Yeah.
It features a 40-minute like prologue, basically, that
Yes.
is this very, very incredible like short film almost.
It's one of those classic 40-minute then title drops. Like, yeah.
One of the best moments in any movie. It becomes something so much more ambitious than I think I would have ever expected. It is one of the most fascinating horror movies I've seen in a very long time, like in years. I absolutely adore it. There are some segments towards the end that are incredible. The conversation towards the end that two characters have in a hospital is just so, oh my gosh, so incredible. A weird sort of like quasi Lovecraftian horror, very weird movie, and I would be very curious for people to watch this without knowing anything about it. It's how I watched it, and I think about it all the time. The Empty Man. You've seen this movie. You like this movie, I hope. Right?
We covered this movie on the old show previously.
Oh, cool.
But yeah, this was definitely like, this was an infamous example of like a movie that it's released by Fox. It's like one of the last, I think it's like technically the last movie to have like the Fox logo on it.
Oh, like the actual Fox,
right.
Not Searchlight Pictures or whatever. Or
No,
Century
not 20th
Pictures.
Century Studios, right? No. So Disney inherited this movie, and they're like, "What the fuck are we gonna do with this?" And then the pandemic hits, and they're like, "Let's put it out in theaters for no one to see." And
Yeah.
like it was very much dumped by Disney after, especially being on the shelf. Like they finished it in like 2017, so it didn't end up coming out until 2020. So it was definitely a movie that neither Fox nor eventually Disney knew what to do with. And admittingly, an incredibly uncommercial movie on like every level.
And if you watch like the trailers, which I've seen like since, I think it gives you the impression that it's gonna be sort of this Blumhouse kind of movie.
It gave me vibes of like The Bye Bye Man.
Yeah, another scary man movie. It is not that in any way.
What I like about that movie is it has kind of the trappings of that, with some like, oh, the legend of the Empty Man. Like there's a whole sequence on a bridge where
Yes.
the kids are trying to like dare each other, like, oh, let's make this happen. And then it's like, oh no, yeah, the Empty Man is like so much more than like, oh, it's like a fantastical dream. It's just like, no, it's a fucking like disease that infects you.
It is. Yes, it is.
Yeah, and amazing performance also from James Badge Dale, who's a great character actor guy. He's such a great sort of actor to like hang that movie on, where he has a bit of an everyman quality, but also that kind of works as like things kind of unravel, like his sort of this fiction. Particularly, there's just a bit, I'll just say, involving him sneaking up to a building in the middle of like the woods, and some people are outside. And that moment, particularly like the look of like what he's looking at, and then when he just says like no, and then leaves, it's like great, amazing stuff. Wonderful movie. I would definitely recommend if you have not seen The Empty Man, definitely.
Yeah, and there's a shot in that sequence when he's like in the woods. It's when he looks up at like the stars, and it like, you know, that shot is one of my favorite moments. I also, I don't know if you know, but he grew up in San Francisco.
And shout out to like that one guy doing the weird like scat talking, like, "Hey man, what's going on?"
Yeah.
But like he's this like scraggly dude, who just like is talking like he's a weird like Twin Peaks character who just shows up. And he's one. Oh, shout out also Stephen Root is great in that fucking.
Stephen Root.
He has one scene and he fucking slays.
It's a great scene. Yeah.
But yeah, solid recommendation.
Yep. And thought plus concentration plus time equals flesh. Just remember that.
Exactly. But my recommendation is another sort of like movie that got kind of dumped. It got dumped only like about a couple months ago from when we're talking here. I have the 2023 horror film Cobweb. One of the few people who saw Cobweb in the theater because it came out Barbenheimer weekend, everybody. That's why you didn't see it. That's why you didn't hear about it. It got dumped Barbenheimer weekend and then left theaters immediately, which is a shame because this movie, which is about this young kid played by Woody Norman, who you might know from Come On, Come On.
Hell yeah.
Joaquin Phoenix film. It's the little kid who gets teased a lot at school, and people make fun of him, and his teacher's trying to like be friendly with him, just like, oh, what's going on? Well, let's have a free form drawing thing. Like, what are you drawing, kid? And he draws like himself in a bed, and he's surrounded by darkness, and it just says help. The teacher's like, this might be kind of a problem. I wonder what this kid's home life's like. And so we follow that kid home, and his parents are Anthony Starr, Homelander himself, and Lizzie Kaplan. It takes place in the modern day, but these parents are like very prim and proper, and it's just like, oh, you can't be, going out and telling people about what happens here at home, because if you do, we're gonna put you down in the attic and stuff like that. They're like a creepy enough to be kind of like fun in the weird way, where just like Lizzie Kaplan and Anthony Starr are very like kind of just measured enough and over the top to where they're intimidating, but still kind of like weirdly fun performances despite the circumstances of this. And this kid is like obviously has these abusive parents, but the main thing they keep telling him is that like he keeps hearing noises in the walls. He keeps hearing like, initially scratches and then a voice, and they're like, hey, don't think about it. Nothing's there. It's probably rats. It's probably just something that's fine. There's nothing in the walls. Spoilers, there's something in the walls. And it's a lot of like this kid trying to like kind of contemplate like, what are my parents doing? What are they hiding from me? But also the teacher keeps kind of trying to come in, and there's a lot of great tension that's built throughout this movie. What could be in the walls? What are these parents doing? What exactly is going on? And it's a bummer this especially got like released in the summer, because it's like a perfect fall movie. Like literally their backyard is a pumpkin patch. And I've got like little pumpkins they gotta like get rid of and stuff. There's a whole scene where Anthony Starr's like, well, we gotta get rid of the pumpkins. Let's dig a hole and put them in there. And it's like, I wonder if you've done this a lot with things that aren't pumpkins. And shit like that. It's director Samuel Bowden, and it's produced by Evan Goldberg and Seth Rogen. They're like their Point Grey studios.
Cool.
But you wouldn't be able to tell because like it's a very muted movie. It has like a great sort of like autumn sheen to it where things are kind of like decaying almost with it. And I won't spoil too much about what happens with like what this maybe entity in the walls is of sorts. But it's wild. It's crazy. It's weird where like it just builds a lot of dread before, and then, dear Lord, does it get gory. It is like just like buckets and buckets of blood during that climax that we didn't expect. I think it's really awesome. I think it got a criminal disservice. So hopefully it'll be out there for the spooky season for you to stream and give it another chance because it deserves it. I think it's a very solid little creepy horror film.
Yeah, it's on my list. I've been wanting to see it since you.
Wait, are you saying you didn't see it? I'm so shocked. I'm so shocked that a movie that the only box office reported for this movie is international. They didn't even report any of the American stuff. None of my money that I paid to see Cobweb is on the box office take.
That is just such a weird... Yeah, I mean, like... Because there are horror movies that release in the summer all the time. But that is such a weird one. Like, because, like... Especially if you're an indie, like, horror movie, you want that, like, fall kind of spooky season bump. So...
It probably would have cleaned up if it came out, like, in late September.
It would... Like, I'm sure it would have, like, done something. Yeah, it's on my list. Huh.
Yes.
Very curious.
But let's repeat our titles for everybody out there, Brian.
Yes, I had the 2020 film The Empty Man from Mr. David Pryor.
And I had the criminally underseen 2023 horror film from director Samuel Bowden, Cobweb. But now we're going to be heading toward the end of the show, so we got to thank some people, including Burial Grid for all our music we use on the show. Purchase his music at burialgrid.com. Thanks to Michelle Kyle for the artwork. Follow her on as at MishKyle96 on Twitter. And thanks to our patrons over at patreon.com/cinema2letter, where for just $1 a month, you all get access to, vote for individual movies we cover, like Skinamarink. You all helped us decide that. And then also you get to hear bonus podcasts. Like around now, we would have had, audio reviews for stuff like The Creator and Exorcist Believer. And I think the next one we would be doing after that, if there aren't any other sort of bits and bops, would be The Killers of the Flower Moon, which should be coming out the week after this drops, which we're very excited about.
Hell yeah.
A horror film about America. the spookiest place.
It's really the scariest entity of them all.
That's true, yes, for sure. From Mr. Scorsese.
Yes. Grandpa.
His grandpa. Everyone's grandpa. But yeah, for just that. And also, we would have already put out our big sort of retrospective on the Friday the 13th franchise. Or we're about to put that out. I'm not sure. Timing is weird. And Brian, I know you haven't seen all of them yet, but that should be a fun discussion, I'm sure.
Yep, I'm working on them. I'm making my way through them.
Making your way downtown. And then also, near the end of the month, we'll have a little thing where Brian and I are going to go to a drive-in and watch a bunch of Universal monster movies, which you also have never seen before.
I've never been to a drive-in theater, and I've never seen any of those Universal monster movies. So, yeah, it'll be really, really interesting.
And we'll have actual audio recorded from the drive-in. Inside of my car. Oh, real scary place, you know what I'm talking about. But yes, all of that for the $1, and we really appreciate it. Helps the show keep going, keeps the lights on, and avoid entities that might be in the dark.
That's true. Otherwise, we'd have to keep the lights on with a CRT TV, and that's just not gonna work out.
Playing public domain cartoons.
Yeah.
Yes. And for more of us, you can find us on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook at cinema2letter. And you can find me on Twitter and Letterboxd at NotTheWho'sTommy. And I also do some writing at both marianithomas.wordpress.com and at film-cred.com.
Yes, you can find me on Twitter still. Unless Elon has started to charge people, in which case I am gone.
In which case all of us are gone. Yeah, we're recording this a bit in advance, so if that happens, everyone's gone. And then Elon would be alone in his own Skinamarink house of his own making.
Yeah, well, he's actually... Yeah. Anyways, I feel like we trash Elon every week when we do this, but...
Hot take, he deserves it. I don't know.
He does deserve it.
Not a fan of that guy. Hot take, I know.
Wait, hold on. What? I think he's got some good ideas. Great names for his kids, at least.
Hello 2009 era, tech companies. Just he's got some great ideas. He's the future.
Yeah.
He's our Tony Stark. He was in Iron Man 2 and everything.
God, he was in Iron Man 2.
Yep.
Ugh.
Rubbing shoulders with Tony Stark, everybody. That's where he is.
God. Yeah, you can follow me on there, though, for now at least, at BRYANDRADE 3. You can also follow me on Letterboxd at my name. And yeah, you can come along with me as I watch these Friday the 13th movies. And hopefully maybe other horror franchises I'll be watching this spooky season. So, yeah.
And for more of us, you can subscribe to this channel on Apple Podcasts and other podcasting platforms. If you're listening on Talk Film Society, you want to listen to all the other great shows that are on the network. And you can also dig into the archives for our first season and all the double-edged double bill stuff over at Podbean. Just all that stuff you can listen to. And of course, if you can't support us for the $1, it can be tight. We understand. The completely free way to help us out is to rate, review, or simply share the show around to give us more visibility. Especially because our voices are very clear, but our faces might not be that visible in the dark. You gotta really look close.
God.
But yeah, so we're ending the show, but we gotta tease our next episode. Our E for egregious pick for this season is gonna be Wish Upon, the 2017 film, which I am a big champion of it being a very entertaining bad film, and Brian has not seen it yet, but I'm very curious how he will react to this little masterpiece. But yeah, until next time, everybody, keep watching them cartoons. They might save you.
Stick a knife in your eye.
No, we don't condone that. The views of Brian Andrade do not reflect those of Cinema2.
For legal reasons, I do not endorse that message.